When the NWO destroys
Anything less would be civilized.
Hello there, friends, and fellow wisdom seekers, fellow truth seekers. How are you today? Also, skeptics, haters, all you too, welcome to the Brave New World Order podcast, straight out the catacombs of podcasting. I am Brandon St. One. Today, we're going to look at a book called The Adam and Eve Story, The History of Cataclysms by Dr. Chan Thomas. A very mysterious book, classified by the CIA soon after its publication in the 1960s, and then released under a Freedom of Information Act request in 2016. But that version, of course, it's the CIA, so it was heavily scrubbed and cleansed, and was missing quite a lot. So I have the full version of this, as well as there's an addition to it that was released in 1993. So I have the full version, and I'm going to go through it all. It's wild. I love it. It's about cataclysms happening throughout the history of the world. It's about the Bible telling the story of a bunch of these cataclysms, specifically Genesis 1, 2, and 3, being like three separate cataclysms. It has an alternate version of Adam and Eve, alternate version of what happened with Jesus, and what happened to him in the missing gap of the years in the Bible, where like he's like a boy and then he's an adult, but what happened in between that, gets into what really happened when he was crucified, and what really happened, like his last words, his final words, Jesus' words. The author, Chan Thomas, has some claims that was mistranslated, and the Adam and Eve story is mistranslated, and the story in the Bible is actually from an ancient tribe called the Naga that's from northern India and goes way, way back. So I'm going to dive into all of this. It's really wild. It's amazing. I hope you enjoy it. Oh, yeah, and it also has UFOs. Has a little bit of everything, this book. The Adam and Eve Story, The History of Cataclysms. We're going to go head first, off a cliff, into the abyss. We're going to become the abyss for a minute, and then we're going to climb out of it with more wisdom and knowledge and just a different perspective and just more data to analyze. So let's get into this. Before I do that, take a second, hit the like button, subscribe, leave a review, follow, share, whatever. Help the Brave New World Order podcast get in the algorithm. I'm not, gonna do TikTok. I'm not really social media. You can follow me on Twitter. I don't really care that much. I go on there. It's fun. Whatever. I like some things. I retweet some things. I really don't actively tweet that much, but you can follow me on there. You can DM me on there if you want to reach out. You can send me an email, the Brave New World Order podcast at gmail.com, on Twitter at Brave NWO podcast. And if you like what I'm doing here and you want to help support the show, you can. There is a link in the show notes. I thank you so much. I'm so grateful for all of you tuning in, listening, reaching out, making connections. That's what this is about. That's how this gets done. Thank you all so much. And let's dive in to the Adam and Eve Story, The History of Cataclysms by Chan Thomas. And who is this mysterious individual, Dr. Chan Thomas? Well, according to this book, Dr. Thomas attended Dartmouth College and Columbia University, graduating from the latter in electrical engineering. As a result of his research and analysis since 1949, Dr. Thomas has become recognized as the world's leading authority in cataclysmology, which I Googled that and tried to find if that's actually like a real field. It doesn't seem to be one. I looked it up everywhere. I can't find anything about cataclysmology being an actual field. And that's really hard to say, so I apologize if I messed that up a bunch of times. I'm going to do my best. But yeah, cataclysmology isn't a real field, and there's nothing out there that says that Dr. Thomas is recognized as the world's leading authority in it. That's interesting. It goes on to say his cross-correlation research in cataclysmology has demonstrated that the cataclysmological concepts, Jesus Christ, that's hard to say, as presented by Deluc in 1779 and Cuvier in 1812, are definitely more acceptable within international scientific circles than they have been previously. His discovery of the process by which nature makes gravity, which has withstood the test of predictability, has enabled him to analyze many sightings of spacecraft and present a plausible analysis of how these crafts are constructed. He devoted 20 years in the writing of the Adam and Eve story, which included 7 years in retranslating Genesis 1, 2, and 3, for which he was awarded the Doctor of Divinity degree and subsequently ordained as a non-sectarian minister. He is the only person to have formalized the science of cataclysmology, achieved through his first cross-correlating known accepted data toward proving or disproving whether cataclysms have happened, then deriving the process of cataclysms, followed by the time schedule of cataclysms, and 15 years of research in deriving the trigger. Okay, that was kind of like convoluted and kind of confusing of a biography, but that's out of the book. And before I dive into the contents of exactly what Dr. Thomas is claiming, I want to just say, like, the way this whole book came out and how it got declassified and how the internet was buzzing about it, and like this biography and just the way this guy's very mysterious and you can't really find anything about him too much. It just, there's something off about it, and that's part of why I think this whole thing is interesting. I think maybe this whole thing is like a operation, a psychological operation, or like a diversion. I'll go into that a little more once we unpack the contents of this book, just so you can see what I'm talking about and why I have my suspicions about this whole thing. I looked up Chan Thomas and can't find that much about him other than I think he passed away in 1998, and he wrote a bunch of other books. I found one of them is called Body 2, and it's about ESP. So I haven't read it yet. I haven't even looked at it, but I downloaded it and I want to read it. And if it's interesting, I'll tell you all about it. But for now, let's look into the contents of the Adam and Eve story, the History of Cataclysms, Chan Thomas, Dr. Chan Thomas. And if you haven't listened to my previous episode, Cataclysm Chronology, that is based off of a completely different set of data, go check that out because I love me some cataclysms. I don't know about you. Find it very fascinating where we come from. Have we been reset a bunch of times over and over again? I don't know. It's fascinating. And that's what the first part of this book talks about, is an upcoming cataclysm that we are long overdue for. And that sounds kind of familiar to my previous episode, like I just mentioned, Cataclysm Chronology, that was based off of Jason Brashears from archaics.com. Check out his YouTube channel. And it's he talks about a 138-year cycle, but coming from an object in the sky. Chan Thomas talks about pole shifts. The pole completely shifts, flips back and forth a couple times, all types of widespread destruction, volcanoes, tsunamis, just hell on earth. He talks about at different times in Earth's history, mammoths and bison were torn and twisted as though by a cosmic hand in a godly rage. In many places, the Alaskan muck blanket is packed with animal bones and debris in trainload lots. Mammoth, mastodon, bison, horses, wolves, bears, and lions, a faunal population in the middle of some cataclysmic catastrophe, was suddenly frozen in a grim charade. I don't know if you've all heard about Graham Hancock, who's been kind of getting the hype lately. He has a show on Netflix called Ancient Apocalypse. Some people think that he's controlled opposition and he's a diversion too, but I think that Graham Hancock is a good jumping point for people to get into at least finding about all these ancient structures all over the world and the similarities and stuff. He may be wrong. He may be controlled opposition. But if you think for yourself and question everything, I think you can definitely find value in a lot of the stuff that he says. But if you listen to Graham Hancock or read Graham Hancock's books, he also talks about the same stuff, things being flash frozen instantly and twisted, And he also talks about the same date. Chan Thomas talks about 11,500 years ago for one of these previous cataclysms happening. And this book was written in 1963, the Adam and Eve story. So, I mean, this guy was talking about this stuff long before Graham Hancock popped on the scene. So I find it interesting that these two things kind of cross over. And I think that's where you can find value in things, whether it's being deceitful or they're just wrong. They might be on to something, but they just don't know. They don't have all the pieces of the puzzle. We don't really know. But I think it's worth it to just look at everybody. So I don't discredit Graham Hancock or even Chan Thomas. Even if this is controlled opposition, it's silly to discard it, throw it away, throw it in the trash, not look at it. We can look at it and we can pick the value. There's, not everybody's right about everything. But even if they're trying to divert us, if we're being aware, we can take the pieces of it that are correct and we can use that. You don't have to go all in 100% with anything or anybody. So that's my little rant about Graham Hancock, and really just about anybody that puts things out there and collects data and is just trying to figure things out. Whether or not they're controlled opposition or not, like I said, you can still take the data and you can analyze it. And if you question it and don't fall for the traps and get all like emotionally invested and twisted up about things, then you can just like listen to somebody. And if you don't agree with them, then it's all good, whatever. So I guess that being said, that's why this book stuck out to me, is because I've read Graham Hancock's books, and then when I see like dates line up and the similarities and things being said, I find it very interesting, and I want to run with it. So let's keep going here with this book. So he explains that all this megafauna, mammoths, all twisted up, frozen instantly. Just like I said, Graham Hancock mentions 11,500 years ago is the first date that he mentions. And then he goes on to explain how he gathered all this information to come up with this conclusion. And he says the first step was to gather all the known accepted data from as many sciences as possible. He calls it that cross correlation. Because if you take the data from the individual sciences and the disciplines, there isn't enough to indicate that these cataclysms are happening. But when he went deep into each individual discipline, like archaeology, radiology, anthropology, paleontology, oceanography, cosmology, astronomy, seismology, all that stuff, he started to see patterns. And that's kind of like what we do here, kind of like what I do, I guess, and what conspiracy theorists do. We're kind of like cross-correlating all this information. That's how I look at it. So after he takes all this data from all these different sciences, they come up with, yes, these cataclysms are happening, but they don't have a cause and they don't know what the timetable is. So they keep on chasing the data. And he discovered a dramatic story of the Earth's history. Civilizations of more than 20,000 years ago, more advanced than our wildest imagination. Prehistoric legends from Greece, Egypt, India, and South America, which became history instead of legend. Lost continents in the Atlantic and Pacific, which became dated realities with logical reasons for their sudden disappearance. Vishnu came alive, a man who lived through a cataclysm many thousands of years ago, actually 10 cataclysms ago. So see, I'm just reading that because it's painting a picture of what this guy believes, how many cataclysms there have been. That's 10. But how many are there really? A bunch. And this, like I said, cross-correlation, archaics.com, Jason Brashears, Phoenix and Nemesis objects that he describes. Maybe Chan Thomas was chasing the same thing, he just didn't know it. And he goes on to talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh, who is actually a Sumerian named, I'm going to mess this up, I'm going to do my best, Utnapishtim, who lived just around 7,000 years ago. The ark he built is more than legend. So he's just painting a picture of how these stories that we've heard through mythology, in the ancient history, they're telling the same stories. A lot of people think like the Noah story and the Epic of Gilgamesh and all these other things are just kind of telling the one, but maybe it's telling many different cataclysms and many floods and many resets. And there is a big interest in resets and mud floods lately. The Great Reset has been put out there by that Klaus Schwab. Maybe that's done on purpose too. Maybe that's the way they tell us about shit like this in a weird way. They come up with this thing, the Great Reset, but they're just telling us that, yeah, there is going to be a reset, but it's not exactly what we're telling you. We're just going to reset the whole world, or something else is going to reset the whole world, and we're preparing for it. So that's why I like talking about all this stuff. I think it's all connected, cross-correlating all this data, putting it out there for you, and also it's for me too. It's selfish because I want to figure this out. So this gives me the opportunity to do so, and that's what it's all about. It's just really about gathering as much data as possible. That unquenchable thirst for knowledge. So let's keep going here. First part of the book that I'm describing, Cataclysms, how he came up with the information, looking at these mythological figures, how they were possibly real people that survived cataclysms and witnessed cataclysms. That's where we're at. The next part of the book, he goes in deeper into the Adam and Eve story in the Bible, and how Genesis 1 and 2 are separate events, and how the earth's conditions at the time of Genesis 1 is almost a perfect description of conditions on our planet right after a cataclysm. And he even says Genesis 2 mentions that a mist arose from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. So he wanted to look more into the Adam and Eve story and exactly the first translation. Where did this story come from? So he looked into Hebrew and Greek because those are usually known as the earliest translations of scripture. But he claims that the story of Adam and Eve doesn't start with Hebrew or Greek. He says it comes from this prehistoric language from this ancient civilization known as the Naga. And this is the first mention of this in this book, and he goes deeper into who the Naga are later. But in this part, he wants to find out how Adam and Eve's story came to be. So he starts with Moses, and he believes that that is plausible since Moses grew up in Egypt, and he probably had access to many religious writings and teachings that are probably now lost to time, that probably got burned down in the Library of Alexandria. But if he got the story of Adam and Eve from these ancient writings, where exactly did it come from, right? Well, Dr. Thomas claims that if Moses did write part of the Old Testament, he then must have had Naga tablet writings or Egyptian interpretations of them handed down to the Egyptians for thousands of years through the royal households, and the Egyptian priesthood had knowledge of a cataclysm 11,500 years ago. Priests of Egypt are supposed to have told Solon during his 10 years in Egypt, about 600 BC, that 9,000 years before that time, there was a cataclysm which buried Atlantis beneath the ocean. Note that 9,000 plus 600 BC plus 1,950 AD equals 11,550 years ago. So he ties in Atlantis too into this. Told you that this has a little bit of everything. Okay, all right. Moses' brother, Aaron, became the first chief priest of the Hebrews about 1,300 BC. Somewhere between 15 and 18 generations later, the chief priesthood, having been handed down from father to son through the generations, Soriah or Sorias was the chief priest. See Ezra and 1 and 2 Esdras. Later, in 586 BC, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Soriah was executed, and his son Ezra made a captive in Persia. See 2 Kings. I'm reading all this now just so you can see how he got this timeline. It's a lot of information. I'm not a Bible scholar, so it's hard for me to explain it exactly. It's better just to read it, what he believes. So, Jerusalem was sacked, and all Hebrew laws and records of the Old Testament were burned with the temple at Jerusalem by Nebuzaradan. Nebuchadnezzar's captain of the guard. Okay? In 458 BC, the 7th year of Artaxerxes' reign in Persia, Ezra was commissioned to reestablish the Hebrew religion and law. According to 2 Esdras, Ezra rewrote the history of the Hebrews from the beginning and reestablished their laws. Now, from 586 to 458 BC is 128 years. See, the reason why this is important to Dr. Thomas here in this book is because he doesn't believe that Ezra really lived that long or served that long for 128 years. He thinks that certain characters in this book were combined. So, for example, he thinks that Ezra's grandfather, Azariah, rather than his father, Sariah, was taken and executed by Nebuchadnezzar. So maybe they were just combined just to tell the story. But Dr. Thomas really wanted to know how this Adam and Eve story came to be. So he comes to the conclusion, after breaking down the dates, that maybe these reigns were divided up around 42.1 to 49.5 years from Aaron to Ezra, as opposed to like the story that's actually told. And it lasts about 845 years. So he thinks that the Adam and Eve story was last seen in writing by Hilkiah or Azariah, therefore handed down verbally, possibly by Azariah, and certainly by Sariah and Ezra, and finally dictated by Ezra to 5 scribes. And it is from those 5 scribes' writings that we have today as Ezra's work. So now, through Ezra's reconstruction of Genesis, we are told many things. And this is where it gets deep about the translation of this story, what it really means, and what it symbolizes. So 1, because of the use of tree, fruit, serpent, cherubim, sword of fire, and other words of Moses, which were glyphs in the picture language of prehistory, it is evident that the creation and Adam and Eve stories were probably written in the glyphs of Naga, the predominant Eastern Hemisphere language of 11,500 years ago. This language is nearly identical to prehistoric Mayan and the progenitor of many languages, which include Oriental and Polynesian tongues, Egyptian, Greek, and Yakut. 2. Moses certainly and possibly Aaron had access to the Royal Egyptian Glyph Stones Library. 3. Neither Moses nor Aaron knew how to read the ancient glyph languages of Naga or Mayan, therefore read the glyphs quite literally. 4. Not being able to read the symbolism of the glyphs, in addition to reading them literally, Moses and Aaron, and possibly Ezra, read into the Adam and Eve story the social and religious attitudes of their day. In that time, women were regarded as the root of all sin, a lowly creature, her birth recorded only as an exception. So the whole point of this part of the book is to pretty much explain that they mistranslated because of their understanding at the time, and they took it quite literally. But what it really is a story told by the Naga using symbolism. So the significant Naga glyphs given to us by Ezra through Moses, direct reading are, these are the important symbols that got taken literally. And then he goes on to explain what they really should have meant. So we have cherubims, rib, Adam's sleep, man, woman, tree, fruit on the tree, serpent, and flaming sword. This is where it gets deep, folks. Our knowledge of Naga glyphs tells us that the tree of life symbolized the mother continent, a parent civilization lasting thousands of years longer than ours of today. An unadorned serpent represented water in its natural state, or the ocean. A serpent entwined around the tree signified that the mother continent was surrounded entirely by water. Genesis 3:15 actually describes Eve's heel on the serpent's head, depicting her victory over the oceans. Cherubims which were not pretty plump babies as we have always thought, but glyphs of hybrid man and beast. They were the glyphs for legs or foundations or underpinnings, instead of being placed in the Garden of Eden. The foundation was taken away, and a Naga or Mayan reading of the Egyptian Book of the Dead shows that cherubims of the north, south, east, and west were taken away, meaning that all the foundations of the mother continent were removed and destroyed. The flaming sword was the symbol of fire and earthquake. The fire signified what all legends of these cataclysms call earth fire, which is the planet-wide molten layer below the Earth's 60-mile thick shell, breaking through to the surface during a cataclysm, a literal hell. It is, as far as I have been able to determine, the origin of man's concept of hell. Now to the tree, it goes on to say. Fruit growing on that tree symbolized the mankind which settled the mother continent ages before Adam and Eve. Their eating the fruit tells us they were descended from this original mankind. Eve eating first signifies that she was the younger generation. Adam eating second signifies that he was her father, which made her his daughter. His daughter? Yes. It is the origin of one of the oldest Hebrew laws. In a catastrophe, if but a male and female survive, they must mate, regardless of their relationship. See? I told you this was going to get weird and out there and deep. I don't know if there's any truth to that being one of the oldest Hebrew laws, but he says to check on the story of Lot and his two daughters. And it goes on to say, the glyph of the creation is even more revealing. There are 3 figures represented on the stone. The top figure is the face of a sleeping or dead person. There were no separate symbols for death and sleep in Naga. Both were represented as the same. The middle figure is shown as a male, and the bottom figure a female who is represented as the mother of all mankind. In addition, there are curved lines from the sleeping or dead person and the male middle figure to the bottom of the female figure. This glyph has been interpreted to mean that the middle figure, a male, was put to sleep, shown by the top figure, and a rib or ribs removed from him, the ribs being the curved lines, and fashioned into the bottom figure, the female mother of all mankind. This fits beautifully with the story of Eve's creation. Adam, therefore, being both the male middle figure and the top figure, a sleeping or dead person. There is a hitch to this story, however. The top figure, either sleeping or dead, is depicted as female. How could it be Adam, asleep, awake, dead, or alive? Moreover, in Naga, the curved lines denote parentage rather than ribs. So, more reasonably, it appears that the top figure is a dead female, whose offspring, by the male middle figure Adam, was the bottom female figure Eve, the mother of all mankind. I have been asked countless times how one can tell the top figure to be a dead female, to the extent that I guess I owe an answer here. In Naga, in prehistoric Mayan, they show that they worship but one deity, and represented that deity by a glyph of a circle representing the sun. Anytime a circle was shown on a tablet, it could only represent their deity. This tablet has 2 circles on it. Purists, quote unquote, have stated that the writers of this tablet meant to show double intensity of the deity. Strange. I have never seen anywhere a double intensity of 2 circles in either Naga or prehistoric Mayan. The curious thing about these 2 circles is that they are located precisely where a female's breast should be on the top figure. Okay. Interesting. The most curious thing about this stone is that it fits the legend of Adam being a widower, and the name of his deceased wife being Lilith. If true, it would also reveal Lilith to be Eve's mother. So in essence, the story, as read from the glyphs, would be that Adam and Eve, who lived in the Garden of Eden on the mother continent, the tree, were descended from the original mankind, the fruit of that land, which incidentally was surrounded entirely by water. The serpent entwined around the tree. Eve was Adam's daughter, and he was a widower. Ain't that some shit, huh? They realized that in order to survive, they had to leave and never try to return, for the motherland was destined to be destroyed by a cataclysmic inundation. Eve had perceived this coming event, and Adam asked her how she had discovered it. She answered that she had inherited the intelligence to do so from her ancestors. As a result, she had gained victory over the inundation. That's Eve's heel on the serpent's head. They left the motherland, and afterward the continent, the tree, was subjected to a fiery earthquake, the flaming sword, during which it lost its foundations, the cherubims, and sank beneath the ocean, the serpent, which remained forever afterward burying the continent, forever afterward crawling on its belly. So let's review the event 2 cataclysms ago, and then apply our knowledge toward a representative translation interpretation of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. It may be the most accurate reading of a story written 11,500 years ago. And then the next part of the book he calls The Event, which talks about the 11,500 years ago flood happening and exactly what happened to the earth, how it was at the time. The continents were different. There was different continents that are now underwater. And it goes all into that pretty in depth. And so I'm not going to go through all the data points because it will get lengthy. But this part goes into this specific cataclysm that happened during the Adam and Eve time that is being explained on those tablets of creation that he mentions, which I tried to find that, and I can't find anything that looks like exactly what he's describing. So I don't know if this is kind of like the Emerald Tablet, where it's kind of just like maybe mythological, maybe it's real, but nobody really has it in its possession right now. So that's what makes this all kind of interesting too. He talks about this Naga civilization and that he has this like in-depth knowledge of it, and there's really not even that much around about them, but still interesting nonetheless. So he's describing the continents being in different places, pole shift, all the hell on earth that happens, and that there's a few survivors left remaining that have fragments of knowledge. And that ties into like Graham Hancock once again, because he talks very frequently about us humans, civilization being one with amnesia, and that we forgot where we really came from. So this ties into that too, so that makes it all that more interesting. Cross correlation, right? That's what it's about. So this book continues on to pretty much retranslate, interpret Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And he says from what the Naga must have been to give us the chapters as we have them in English. Then retranslating directly from Naga to English, bypassing Greek and Hebrew. So this is the part in the book where he retranslates Genesis 1, 2, and 3. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's like 15 pages, and it's like a reimagining of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And I'm going to post a link, so I highly recommend you take a look at all this for yourselves. As well as the next part of the book called Cataclysms Revisited. And once again, this is a big, giant section going through all the data points and the different like geological data, as well as the different animals, the megafauna, stuff I already mentioned, stuff he mentions, but it goes a little more deep into that. So I'm going to browse over that to get to the goods, which is the second book that came out in 1993 called The Aftermath of the Adam and Eve story. So let's jump into that, because this one gets wild, because then it starts getting into Jesus, angels, UFOs, Jesus and the cataclysms, all this crazy stuff. Evolution, he rips into evolution. So we're going to go through it just like I did the first book and kind of just pick out key things that I find to be interesting. And the first part of the book is pretty interesting. It talks about the Earth's magnetic field and how that is weakening, and he believes that is part of the cause of these cataclysms, that ever so often the Earth's magnetic field weakens, the poles shift, and all hell breaks loose. But the interesting part of this is that he talks about experiments that were done with mice that replicated these conditions of low magnetic field, and they start turning criminal and maniacs, and they kill each other, they rape each other. And his whole like hypothesis is, as the Earth's magnetic field starts weakening, people are going to start acting like that and crazy. And I don't know, this book came out a long time ago. This part in 1993. So I don't know. You can do your own, correlation thinking about how the world is, what's going on in the world, people acting more violent, more crazy. I don't know. It's something to think about. I mean, there's definitely something happening, whether it's an awakening or, like somebody said, I saw a quote. Somebody said, we're either in the middle of a great awakening or the complete collapse of civilization. So I don't know. It seems like something is going on. So it's worth mentioning and noting that the magnetic field of the Earth, according to Dr. Chan Thomas, has an effect on us, humans, and the animals of the planet as well. And that their behavior, our behavior, is a good like indicator of when the next cataclysm is coming. And he uses this part of the book to warn you to get your shit together and start preparing for these events, because your neighbors are going to turn on you and all that, so forth and so on. And then the next part of the book he titles Jesus as History. And this is pretty interesting stuff. So I'm going to read through because it gets complicated. It's about the translation of Jesus' words and how they were probably mistranslated, especially his last words upon the cross. So let's dive into this. There are 3 passages in the Bible which concern us from the viewpoint of history alone. They are in the New Testament. 1, Matthew 27:34 and 45 through 50. 2, Mark 15:33 through 37. 3, John 19:28 through 30. This part of the book is important because he claims that the words Jesus spoke upon the cross weren't even a language that anybody else understood at the time, and that they were just trying to record what they thought he was saying. This is according to Dr. Chan Thomas, of course. So Jesus on the cross says something. I'm not going to read it because it's going to sound like gibberish. I can't really pronounce this like correctly. So Jesus said stuff that they think was, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? That's like the big one. I even know that one. So that's the translation. But according to this guy, Chan Thomas, he says, let's discuss those words Jesus spoke so vividly described by Matthew and Mark. Both Matthew and Mark put a question mark after the quote of Jesus' words. When Jesus spoke them, he created quite a bit of confusion. Some said, hey, he's calling Elias. Maybe he'll come and save him. Others said that he was thirsty. John said simply, Jesus said, I thirst. Someone in the crowd, thinking Jesus said he was thirsty, soaked a sponge in vinegar, put it on a reed, and held it to Jesus' mouth. We must give immense credit to Matthew and Mark for writing down as best as they could the sounds of the words Jesus spoke. From what they wrote, we know that no such words existed in Hebrew at the time, nor did they exist in Aramaic, nor in Greek, nor in any other language of which we know for that area and that time. Why did Jesus, in his dying moments, use a language which no one else knew? The best Matthew and Mark could do was say, which is being interpreted, and that is to say. And he says, thank God for their honesty. And as for the difference between Matthew's and Mark's, okay, so the words he says are Eli, Eli, or Mark's Eloi, E-L-O-I, compared to E-L-I. So Matthew has him saying E-L-I, and Mark has him saying the words E-L-O-I. Eloi? I don't know. We must consider the crowd's reaction. The only reaction quoted is in both Matthew and Mark as Jesus having said, Elias. If we are reduced to a choice, we would have to go along with Eli, Eli. So, all right, Eli, Eli. E-L-I. So this guy believes the E-L-I is the correct one. And he says he searched and could not find the words in any language either. In desperation, I turned to the parent language, prehistoric Mayan or Naga. There, the words were as large as life. And then he has them written, I hate trying to read this stuff. Heli Heli Lamat Sabak Tani, which is, he says, I am fainting, darkness is overcoming me. Since Jesus is quoted as having cried with a loud voice in both Matthew and Mark, perhaps we should quote the translation to be, I am fainting, darkness is overcoming me. Why did Jesus speak a language that nobody else around him spoke, that nobody else could understand? And where did he pick up this language from? That's what this next section of the book gets into. It gets into the lost days of Jesus, because according to Chan Thomas, there is a total of only 55 days of Jesus' life accounted for in the Bible. And it says we are left with him at the age of 12. And then that leaves about 18 years of Jesus' life unaccounted for in the Bible. So this goes into the theory that Jesus went to like India and he studied lots of different methods and learned lots of different wisdom. And this book goes into him going to northern India and learning Naga with this Naga tribe and becoming like a high priest because Jesus was a genius, according to Chan Thomas. And then there's one passage in the Bible when he's real young and he's hanging out at the temples and shooting the shit with like the elders and all the smart people. So if he was able to do that at 8 years old, Chan Thomas thinks that indicates Jesus was some kind of genius and was operating on like a higher level of intelligence than the rest of the people around him. So he went off to search for wisdom that he couldn't find near him locally. And he ended up in India, and we know that he probably ended up in Egypt, and he probably learned a lot of the mystery schools and lots of stuff that has been kept from us. Who knows, right? Purely speculation, all interesting theories. So Chan Thomas claims in the mid-1800s, the British Army was stationed in northern India near the town of Ayodhya, prehistorically known as Ajudhya. They discovered that there was a temple there, of which there were only 3 of that kind in India. In pre-Brahmin India, all temples were of this kind and were called Nakal temples. The official language of these temples, the British found out, was Naga, or prehistoric Mayan. Cautiously enough, there was a tribe in the extreme north of India called the Naga tribe. This tribe, even today, speaks pure Naga as their everyday language. They told the British of Jesus having been there as a late teenager, young adult, who attended the Nakal temple as a student and graduate of the temple. He was especially remembered through tradition because he was a genius. Students were taught rigorous courses from mathematics to medicine, languages, what we call ESP, out-of-body travel, metaphysics as a science, and natural healing. The course was so rigorous that it usually took the lifetime of a normal person to graduate from the temple. So Jesus obviously didn't spend his lifetime. He excelled and blasted right through that course, becoming master and graduate at 25 to 30 years old. Chan Thomas says, on investigating, I found that travel was quite common between the Holy Land and India in Jesus' time. He could have made the trip there very easily at 15 to 20 and back just as easily 10 to 15 years later. So he's claiming Jesus went there, spent 10 to 15 years learning to speak and write Naga, and he's probably spoke it as a sole language for that duration. So that could account for him in his last moments speaking that language. And Chan Thomas claims that Jesus' entire doctrine that he taught, his philosophy of religion, was exactly as he had learned it at the temple. All right, so now that we know all about the Naga tribe and how they're in northern India and how it would have been very easy for Jesus to go there for all the missing years in the Bible and learn what they had to say about reality and then come back and teach others about it, let's go back and summarize everything we know about his last words on the cross. First thing we know, our only reasonable source of the words Jesus actually spoke is through Matthew and Mark. Second, it is abundantly clear that Jesus spoke in a loud voice. There is a difference between listening to sounds and hearing them. Matthew and Mark listened to him to the extent that they were able to write down the phonetics of what Jesus said to the best of their ability. We recognize that their attention to details of the phonetics was enhanced by the loudness with which Jesus spoke. John didn't pay much attention to detail. He just heard Jesus speak loudly and assumed that Jesus said merely, "I thirst," without even attempting to listen to or write down the phonetics of the words Jesus spoke. Third, our only primary source of the meaning of those words is through Matthew, Mark, and John. Matthew said, that is to say, Mark said, which is being interpreted, and John said, Jesus saith, "I thirst." It is clear that Matthew and Mark were not translating, but giving us their best guesses what the words Jesus spoke meant. John just guessed outright. The most interesting aspect of Matthew's and Mark's recordings is that the phonetics of Jesus' words and their meaning are so nearly alike, with only one syllable. The li, as recorded by Matthew, and the loi, as recorded by Mark. That's the li and the loi. I think that's how you say it. I don't know, but that's the only difference. I mentioned it earlier. The eli and the eloi is the only difference. It appears that each had his own memory, as referred to by those in the field of aptitude studies as tonal memory of the sounds of the syllable, suggesting independent recording of the phonetics by each of them. However, their interpretations of the meaning of Jesus' words are precisely the same, suggesting that they conferred with each other, comparing their interpretations and arriving at a mutually agreed upon interpretation of what Jesus meant by what he spoke loudly. Certainly, neither of them compared their memories with Luke or John. It appears that we must honor Matthew's and Mark's accuracy in recording the sounds of the words Jesus spoke. It's plausible, since Jesus spoke loudly. Fourth, we have no secondary source of the words Jesus spoke. We only have secondary sources through Matthew, Mark, and John, who tell us about the crowd at the scene and their reaction to what they thought Jesus said. Some in the crowd said, "Hey, he's calling to Elias. Maybe he'll come and get him down off the cross," as if it were a big joke. So they were like mocking him, like, "Elias is going to come get him, haha." And then someone else said, "He says he's thirsty. Someone give him a drink." So someone ran to a bowl of vinegar, put a sponge on the reed, soaked it in the vinegar, and gave it to Jesus. Of course, John added his bit by writing, "Jesus said, I thirst." It is obvious that there was a great amount of confusion resulting from Jesus' words, with three known interpretations of those words. Isn't it interesting and provocative that those three versions differed from each other to the extent that there is absolutely no comparison between them? Fifth, it is a fact that Jesus' words did not exist in any known language at that time, including Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Eli expressly was not a part of the Hebrew tongue. That's the Eli. It was entered into that language since then to mean "my God." It seems strange that those who fostered and shouted for his crucifixion would be the ones to adopt one of the words Jesus spoke on the cross into their language. Very interesting. Sixth, we must take into consideration Jesus' physical condition at the time he spoke those strange words. Contrary to one of the popular myths, Jesus was not nailed to the cross through his hands and spaces through his bones and his lower feet leading to his toes. It was a common form of execution in that time, and always the nails were driven through a space in the wrist bones, as if driven through the hands. The crucified could pull his hands off the nails easily while on the cross. Plus, the same conditions existed in the feet of the crucified. In order to keep him from pulling his feet off the nails, the nail or nails had to be driven through a space between the upper foot bones. Therefore, the crucified became literally a prisoner of the cross. The only way to get him off the cross was to pull the nails. The crucified was nailed to the cross in such a way that, with his knees bent somewhat, he could hang by his arms and rest his legs. After a while, his diaphragm would enter the early stages of paralysis, and he would feel suffocation oncoming. Then he would straighten his legs, standing on his nailed feet, providing relief for his arms from bearing the stress of holding up his body, thereby relieving the stress on his diaphragm, leading to a paralysis and suffocation. Consequently, he endured a running continuum of up and down, up and down, up and down for hours and hours. Those responsible for performing the crucifixion had a way of stopping this endurance test. They simply broke the legs of the crucified so that he couldn't stand on them anymore. He was forced to hang by his arms without surcease. He soon fell into full paralysis of his diaphragm and died of suffocation. It is known that Jesus suffered scourging for some time before his walk to crucifixion with Simon of Cyrene, who was compelled by soldiers to carry his cross. Scourging meant torture with whips and barbs in the ends of the lashes of each whip. Those barbs ate deeply through Jesus' skin and into his flesh. So he makes the point that Jesus was still able to carry himself and walk successfully, so he believes he had not yet entered a state of deep shock. But once Jesus was on the cross, he entered into a state of deep shock. And then in that condition, it was impossible for him to feel any pain. This is what he's claiming. Of course, this is straight out of the book I'm reading. While in that condition, he lost consciousness, and while entering that state, he said as loud as he could the quote, I'm not going to say it again, but that darkness was overcoming him in the Naga language. So to sum it all up, Jesus was scourged on his way to the cross, tortured, carrying the cross, but he's exhausted. But by the time he gets there and they put him up on that thing, he's just in a complete state of shock. And then he utters those words in a language that nobody else understands because he's not really with it. So he diverts back to his younger years and speaks the Naga language. Definitely some out there, very big, bold claims by Dr. Chan Thomas back in, this one was out in 1993, but the original is 1963. Very big, bold claims by this guy. Like I said, this book is jam-packed. It's not that big of a book, but he jam-packs a lot of little conspiracy theories and out there thoughts and ideas that he has, and it's pretty good stuff. I'm glad I came across this. There's another section in here I'm going to go over, and it's called Angels and UFOs. So he goes a little crazy in this one. I love it. He makes some bold claims at the beginning of this chapter, but he doesn't get into too much detail, which I find that this book has a lot of. It has a lot of claims, but it doesn't have a lot of data, but it's still awesome. He claims he's seen all types of UFOs and aerial phenomena, motherships, size of cities, smaller ones, and he claims to know how all this stuff operates. And he gets into the subject about angels, and he asks the question, what is an angel? And then further, who is an angel? And he says Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote about angels as if they were a normal, accepted part of life in their times. And he says it all started when Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome decided to go to the sepulchre where Jesus was buried. There they found the blocking stone removed, and Jesus gone. They found one or two men there. Matthew said he was an angel, whose countenance was like lightning, and his raiment white as snow. Mark said, and entering into the sepulchre, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, clothed in a long white garment. Not once did Mark mention that there was an angel there. Luke said, and it came to pass, as they, presumably the three women, were much perplexed thereabout, behold, two men stood by them in shining garments. John said, but Mary stooped down and looked into the sepulchre, and seeth two angels in white sitting, the one at the head and the other at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain. Okay, so now we have four different interpretations of the same story once again, just like the last words of Jesus. Four stories from four different men, and according to Chan Thomas, neither one of these men were actually there. So this is four different interpretations of second-hand information. So what he says we can conclude from these stories is the angels look like men. In fact, they must have been men. 2. Whether there were one or two of them, he or they wore long, bright, white, clean, glistening robes. 3. Although strangers, they could speak Hebrew, and spoke calmly and authoritatively to the women. 4. Whether one or two of them, they had countenances which caused fear in the women. Except in the story related by John, it could be that Mary Magdalene, in her first visit to the sepulchre with the other two women, had visited with the man or men at that time, and who had dispelled the women's fears with his or their words. So when she returned, she had no fear. What about these men? They were not known anywhere, They were dressed totally differently than anyone in the area or even far away from that area. They showed absolutely no fear of anyone or anything, and Matthew stated that the angel of the Lord descended from heaven and rolled back the stone from the door of the sepulchre. And then Chan Thomas just dives right in to these angels actually being UFOs that came in a space vehicle that was similar to Ezekiel's wheel. And why did they do that? Well, he goes on to claim now that there are aliens and UFOs and races of creatures that watch us, and they don't really come down and pay too much attention to us because our whole planet is just like a cesspool. But they did have an interest in Jesus, and they followed him his whole lifetime. And then after the aftermath of his crucifixion, they came and dealt with the situation and then took his body. So he makes this claim, but he doesn't get into like the resurrection part of the whole thing. So I'm assuming that he thinks they took him after the crucifixion and then resurrected him and brought him back. So I really wish he dove more into this, Dr. Thomas, in the book, this part of it, like exactly what he believes about these angels and UFOs coming down and paying so much attention to Jesus and what happened after they took his body and how they resurrected him or what his theories are on that. But instead, he decides to go off on like a tirade about our current situation in the world and the government's being corrupted. And I mean, he's not wrong about a lot of it, but I don't want to go through this whole part of it because it's like, yeah, we all kind of know the whole world's corrupt, right? So he just goes into that, everything, everybody being corrupt, the 16th Amendment not actually ever being ratified, taxes are illegal, just all that stuff, the basics. So that's where I'm going to leave it with the Adam and Eve story, the history of cataclysms, the aftermath of the Adam and Eve story, the second book. I'm going to put the link to where I found this so that you can get, because there's a lot more. I went through things that I found very interesting, but this book has a lot more for you to read and definitely take it in. I find it awesome. Definitely like a good piece of the puzzle. But I'm going to go on and just let you know my thoughts on the timing of the release of this book and my thoughts on Chan Thomas and how it's so mysterious. Okay, so the declassification of this book came out in 2016, I believe. And, since then there's been such a hype in UAPs, UFOs. So much about that has been released. They've had committees. They've pretty much told us that they know that there's things out there they can't even understand. Also, at this time, there's been just a huge awakening and just information about like where we are in this earth. There's lots of alternate history theories out there, mud floods, Tartaria, all that stuff. And there's lots of data for all of us to get swept up in, to get corralled into something. And I think maybe the release of this book was done on purpose because it definitely blew up and everybody was talking about it. People have been talking about it for a while, and especially with the the interest, like I just said, in Tartaria, ancient history, resets, the Great Reset. I don't know, maybe it's a diversion to get us off like what they truly know about cataclysms. I don't know if Chan Thomas, I don't know. I'm looking at a bunch of different things. I like the Archaics research about the 138-year Phoenix object in the sky, the Nemesis object. If you haven't listened to my Cataclysm Chronology episode, go back and listen to that. It goes through 138-year cycle of cataclysms that happens, and there's a reason for it. So go back and listen to that. Check that out. Also, check out archaics.com. Jason Brashear is doing pretty good work over there. I find his stuff to be pretty awesome as far as ancient history. It kind of, for me, when I discovered that, tied in a lot of stuff. So go check that out. Check out it all. Take as much data as you can. But I think, back to what I think about this book, I think it might be a diversion. I think there's a lot of stuff in it that might be true, but I think it might be to get us off, maybe the Phoenix, maybe to take us away from the objects in the sky, maybe just be more like thinking magnetic pole shifts and stuff like that. I don't really know. Just my thoughts, just to give as I was going through this book, it just seems so weird. This guy, this Chan Thomas guy, the author description about him, how it says he's the world's foremost leading cataclysmology, and there's like no such thing, like all this stuff. I don't know. Maybe he was just a CIA guy. Maybe the CIA wrote this and made this guy up. Maybe he's not even a real person. I don't know. But it's all very interesting stuff. Worth a read, worth taking in the data, cross-correlating it, matching it up to other different things that you've been checking out and reading, and just seeing the patterns and the parallels. That's really what it is. I'm not saying anything is 100% real or not. It's just exploring all this wisdom and knowledge out there, taking in the data, like I said. So, that being said, I'm going to get out of here. Thank you so much for joining me as I explored the Adam and Eve story, The History of Cataclysms by Dr. Chan Thomas. Very mysterious book, very mysterious author. If you like this episode, please leave a review, click the like button, subscribe, follow, share, send it off to your friends, your family, random people you see at the store, whatever. Help the Brave New World Order podcast. Help me, your humble host, Brandon St. One. I'm doing this by myself, ad-free, putting the wisdom out there, the knowledge. I hope you're enjoying it. If you want to help out, you can click the link in the show notes. There is a link in there for you if you want to support the show. I thank you all so much from the bottom of my heart joining me on my journey, dissecting this reality, and I'll see you soon. In the meantime, stay positive, think for yourself, question everything. Much love. Peace.